Yeah, I'm absolutely addicted to these types of sounds. They are so cool. Today, you're going to learn how to create really detailed and interesting percussion grooves without having to rely on drum rack or having to draw in your MIDI notes manually. So let's dive right in. The only thing I have prepared is this 4x4 kick groove. The BPM is set to 106, so it's rather down tempo. First thing you want to do is create a MIDI track, hit Command-Shift-T, and in this MIDI track, we're going to load up samples. You can really load in any sample that you'd like, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to use percussion grooves because I feel like those work really well. So we're going to drag and drop into where it says drop instrument here. Now we're going to right click it, convert the simpler to sampler. Now we're going to open up this zone over here. I'm going to enlarge this panel a bit, and by default it's either set to key or velocity. We want to make sure that we're working with selector, and this allows us to select multiple samples using this slider over here. Let's take in a couple more percussion loops, and you can take your time and select loops that you genuinely like, but for the sake of a demonstration, I'm going to keep it really simple. Drag and drop all of these loops into this selector panel over here. And if you hit Command A, it selects all of those individual samples. As you can see here in the sampler, 42 of 42 samples selected. Now, once we hover over these notes, you see this kind of bracket appearing. Just right click, select, distribute ranges equally. And now it literally distributes those ranges equally. So every time we slide this slider, it triggers a different sample, which is already pretty cool that Ableton Live offers that. Now we're going to group the sampler. So we're going to hit Command or Control G. We're going to open up our macro controls. And the first thing we want to map is the selector, right? It switches back to key. Just make sure to go back to selector. Right click this guy over here, map to macro 1. So that's going to be our sample selector. So each time we tweak the macro, it also moves this sample selector ruler over here, which is pretty cool. And right now I could also start playing the percussion. All right, I'm playing the C on my MIDI keyboard. And depending on the position of this ruler over here, it triggers a different sample. But remember, we want to make this musically relevant. We want to make it usable. I could create something as of now using MIDI and doing it manually. But again, I did promise you a more generative approach. So let's continue. We can now close the zone, open up pitch oscillator. And how about we map the transpose to macro 2? So we can also control the pitch of all of the samples. You see, that can be handy. Why not map it? Now let's go into filter global, and you see this section over here. This is our amplitude envelope section. And this section over here, we get control of the filter parameters, but we don't want that now. We just want the amplitude envelope settings. And my favorite parameters to map are decay. So right click decay, map to macro 3, sustain. Let's map that to macro 4, and the release. Let's map that to macro 5. So ultimately, with these three parameters, we are controlling how short the sample is. So decay and sustain, they determine how short the sample is, how plucky, how percussive, how much transient. Release determines how long that percussion loop will be played after we let go of the MIDI note. For example, let me increase the release for you to 60 seconds, and I'm just going to shortly hit the C note on my keyboard. It'll play that 60 seconds long after I release the MIDI note. But if I change it back down to 1 millisecond, you can really hear the difference. And if I tweak the sustain decay, shorten that out, it becomes even more plucky. That's pretty cool. And remember, it applies it to every single sample that we've previously imported into this zone selection here. What we're gonna do now is load up a Sting device. Sting is a Max for Live sequencer that is used to create acid patterns. So those, you know? But we're not going to use it for that type of vibe today. We're going to use it for percussions. And there are two versions. There's Sting 64 by Skinnerbox, which is the old school version that I used in this video, by the way. But we're going to use the newer version, Sting 2022 by Iftah, because it gives us a few more functions here. And by default, if I hit play, isn't that freaking dope? It already triggers us one sample of this entire rack, but it just plays us a single sample. I don't want that. I want it to trigger multiple samples. So what we're going to do is load up an LFO, put that LFO somewhere after our sampler over here, map that to the sample selector. So now you can already see that it's starting to move at a rate of 1 Hertz. We can also change that to a note value. So every bar it selects different samples. You can also change the waveform to square so it jumps between 2 values. But I usually like to keep it on sine, maybe dial down the depth. And the cool thing is that we also have multi-map. So if we click this panel over here, click map, we can also map it to the decay, to the sustain. You could also map it to the release, but I'm going to leave it at one static value here. Perhaps also the transpose, who knows? You see? Yeah, but I don't like it transposing the sound. That's something that I'd like to do manually. So I'm just going to delete the mapping here, move out of multi-map, and set the transpose here. Nice. You see how the parameters are adapting according to the LFO? Here too. Nice. So Sting is generating us MIDI, which is pretty cool. You can determine the length. Right now it's set to 16 steps. If you want more polymetric or polyrhythmic results, you can then change it to 15, 13, 14 steps that are uneven. You can also change the density. That'll then include less notes. Or you could increase it to 16 to include many individual notes. Cool. And by hitting that smiley here, it generates you a different MIDI pattern, including different notes. And that ties along really well with the sample selector because you're selecting different samples using the LFO already, and the smiley gives you an additional option to vary your groove. And you can also change the type of randomness here, the way it selects the MIDI notes. Just try yourself out and see which one sounds good to you. You can also add offset, which is just amazing if you want to add a bit more humanization to your groove to offset the MIDI notes slightly. You can also increase the accentuation, so the velocity difference, the intensity of notes is slightly varied as well. And just hit that smiley. You can also swing it so it starts shuffling more, becoming more groovy. Nice. And if you have this pitch MIDI device loaded onto your tracks, which I have set by default, you can also change the pitch of the entire percussion groove here. What I love about Sting is that you can also hit clip, hit tab, and while you drag the clip, hit tab again, drag it back here, you can see your MIDI note values here, which is just pretty amazing if you want to export your own drum grooves and save the MIDI along as well. But I'm not going to use the MIDI for now. I'm just going to use the device itself. One last thing that I'd like to show you, and this is also somewhat advanced, and I'm not going to dive really deep into it, but I just want to show you it. There's this device called Expression Control, which you can find under your MIDI effects. It's also Max for Live. We're just going to chuck it in right after the Sting, and we're going to load up a shifter device. Type in shifter, go into pitch and modulation shifter, and we're going to chuck it in right after the LFO. For the sake of simplicity, we're only going to be using this first little velocity panel over here. We're going to click map, similar to how LFO works. I'm going to scroll and map that to the fine of the shifter here. And the reason I'm using shifter is because it really works well on repitching drums. And in my experience, this shifter plugin sounds a bit cleaner than just using the transpose. So we're going to use shifter and keep this transpose just as a backup. So remember, we've mapped our velocity to the fine tune of the shifter. So each time we have MIDI notes that are played at a lower velocity, we get lower pitch notes. Each time we hit a note that has a higher velocity, a higher intensity, that's played like really hard, you get a higher pitch. That can give you some really interesting results. So let's just hit play here. Nice. And if you hit that smiley a couple times, let's remove the mapping here to see the difference. It's really tiny, but I feel like it adds a bit of flavor. Map the velocity to the fine tune again. You can also click wide to widen the percussion. Let's disable it for now though. So now let's create maybe a more polyrhythmic result by changing the length to 13 steps and decrease the density to around somewhere towards the middle. Let's add a bit more swing, change the type of randomization, and hit that smiley. What the? Hit it a couple more times. You hear that? Doo-wop, doo-wop. Doo-wop. That's a frequency shifter. Let's disable it. It sounds good, but it sounds rather organic. If we want to have something that sounds more experimental and strange and detailed, we could remap this to, you guessed it, the shifter, the fine tune. You can also change the minimum or maximum values, dial in on the range here, and hit that smiley. Nice. What I also like doing is changing the rate. Right now we're playing 16th notes. We could also change it to 3/16. Whoa. You can also dial down the gate so the notes become shorter. This decreases the length of the MIDI notes, but I like to keep it long. And let's change it back to 16th. And you know what? We can always go back to the LFO too and change the values over here. That is so cool. Holy moly. Now I'm going to create a new audio track, Command T, and select instrument rack 2 as our input here. Make sure that it's on post mixer, hit record. And now if we hit record up here, it's going to record all those percussion into a new layer. And while doing so, I could tweak my parameters here. Yeah, I love turning up the release. It gives me all those little in-between Foley-ish type sounds. Yeah, I'm absolutely addicted to these types of sounds. They are so cool. And now the rest of the clip we can just chop off. Hit Command E, delete that little section here. We can then highlight our entire loop. Hit Command L, disable the instrument rack over here that has the sting on it, and work with the audio now. And maybe there's something that I would find here that I could just chuck in and use. Maybe I don't want the entire loop. Maybe I just want this little selection over here. So I'll highlight it, hit Command E, chop it out, maybe delete the rest, disable clips that I don't like by hitting 0 on my keyboard. You know, it might be that you just want that single hit, who knows? Or you could take the time and dial in on your entire loop. You could double click it, zoom in, change your grid to, let's say, 16th or 8th. I like working with 8th. You can then select maybe just 2 of these 8th notes, hit Command L to loop them up. And you got yourself a new groove. Select 3, maybe 3/8 notes so you get more polyrhythms. And just take your time. You can then duplicate the entire layer. On layer 2, you can go back into clip view by double clicking the sound, maybe select a different part. Lovely. I love that. And as a way to make it fun, I'm just going to extend the loop by adding some sounds and getting a groove going. So you could add some shakers, toms, just to make the groove a bit more full. Got some Afro vibes. Yeah, you get the point. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, like and subscribe, and you can find all these sounds on Lotus Tunes. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.